Lonna Ellsworth had spent most of her life in a quiet suburb just outside Richmond, Virginia, in a modest one-story house she and her husband Harold had built together piece by piece over nearly 5 decades. The home smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and every corner held memories of their long marriage. Harold had always been the gentle one, the planner, the saver, the man who worked double shifts and tucked away every spare dollar for their future and for their only son Miles. They had risen from nothing, scraping through lean years, but Harold never complained. He always said that hard work meant nothing if you didn't use it to build a future for the people you loved. On an early autumn night, when the leaves outside were beginning to turn orange, Lonna heard a heavy thud from the living room. She rushed in and found Harold collapsed beside his favorite armchair, his hand still gripping the edge of a quilt she had made years earlier. His face had gone pale, his breath was shallow. Lonna fell to her knees, shaking him, calling his name again and again, her voice breaking. By the time the ambulance arrived, rain was pouring so hard it blurred the flashing lights, and the paramedic's expression told her everything before a single word was spoken. Harold was gone. A sudden heart attack had taken the man who had stood beside her for 45 years. The house felt unbearably large that night. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, the shadows seemed to stretch across the room, and Lonna sat alone on the cold floor clutching Harold's glasses in her trembling hands. She tried to steady herself long enough to make the call she dreaded most. With fingers stiff from shock, she dialed her son. Miles answered with the booming noise of ocean waves behind him. He and his wife Heather were in Miami, celebrating a late summer getaway at a luxury beachfront hotel. Lonna could hear laughter, glasses clinking, and upbeat music filtering through the phone. When she told him his father had passed away, the line went silent for only a moment, just long enough for her to think he might break down in grief. Instead, Miles sighed as if inconvenienced and said he couldn't leave right away because their plans were already booked and paid for. He told her to handle the arrangements on her own and that he would catch a flight in a few days. Heather's voice chimed in from the background, light and careless, telling Lonna they had been looking forward to this vacation for months and it would be a shame to cut it short. They were smiling in their voices while Lonna's heart was collapsing. That night the thunderstorm outside grew stronger, and water streamed down the windows as if the sky itself was grieving. Lonna sat at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from her. Harold had always sat there, tapping his fingers to the rhythm of whatever country song drifted from the radio. Now the air felt colder, the silence heavier. She felt the weight of the world pressing against her chest, each breath a struggle. The next morning, she forced herself to begin the funeral preparations. She drove through the wet streets to the funeral home, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She met with the director alone, choosing a coffin, selecting flowers, signing papers through blurred vision. She visited the county office to obtain the death certificate, waiting quietly between strangers while the rainwater soaked the cuffs of her slacks. Every step felt like pulling her feet through thick mud, but she kept moving because there was no one else to do it. In the days leading up to the funeral, Miles posted smiling photos of himself and Heather on social media. Miles in sunglasses holding a cocktail. Heather posing beside a pool. The two of them laughing on the beach while Lonna sat alone in the kitchen sorting through her husband's belongings, her tears soaking the folded shirts. She waited each day for her son to call again, but he didn't. The only message she received was a casual text saying they would be home soon. The funeral day arrived cold and gray. Only a handful of neighbors and distant relatives came, offering quiet condolences while the wind swept fallen leaves across the cemetery. Lonna stood at the front with her hands clasped together, staring at Harold's photo. She whispered to him that she was trying her best, that she wished he were still here to guide her, that she didn't understand why their son had become so distant, so cold. The pastor spoke gentle words, but they drifted past her like fading echoes. When the burial ended and the guests left, Lorna remained alone beside the grave until the sky grew dim. Her heart felt hollow, as if grief had carved out something irreparable. She eventually returned home, stepping into a silence so deep it made her knees weaken. She sank onto the sofa, the ticking clock filling the emptiness, and hugged one of Harold's old sweaters to her chest. That night, she didn't sleep. She wandered through the house, touching the objects Harold had touched, opening drawers he had organized, running her fingers across the wooden table he had sanded by hand years ago. She whispered aloud, asking why she had been left behind. She had always believed that family stayed together in times of crisis, yet her own son treated his father's death like a passing inconvenience. In the quiet dark, Lorna realized this loss was only the beginning. Though she didn't know it yet, the days ahead would bring betrayals more painful than anything she had imagined, and the loneliness she felt now would soon be overshadowed by a storm far more devastating than the rain pounding against her windows. In the week following Harold's funeral, the Ellsworth home seemed to move in slow motion. Dust drifted through afternoon sunlight like tiny ghosts, and the floorboards creaked under Lorna's fragile steps as if mourning with her. She spent her mornings sitting before the small wooden shrine she had arranged for Harold on a side table in the living room, his favorite photograph in a simple frame, a candle that burned low each night, and the worn pocketknife he had carried since he was a young man working rail repairs. She often found herself speaking to the photograph as though he were still sitting across from her, telling him about the little things, the weather, the neighbors' dogs, the way the house felt colder without his footsteps. One quiet morning, with the sky overcast and the house wrapped in silence, Lorna gathered the courage to open the heavy drawer in Harold's old desk. Inside were all the financial documents he had kept so meticulously organized: savings accounts, land titles, certificates, and letters he had written to himself outlining plans for their future. His handwriting, steady and careful, nearly broke her heart. He had always said that money was only meaningful if it could lift someone else up. And every time he talked about helping others, his eyes softened with the same tenderness he showed when holding their newborn son decades ago. Lorna sat for hours reading through the papers, her fingers trembling as she absorbed the numbers. Harold had saved far more than she realized. Decades of disciplined budgeting, skipped vacations, overtime shifts, and quiet sacrifices had accumulated into enough money to provide comfort for the rest of her life. There was also the small patch of land behind the old train tracks that Harold had purchased back when property was cheap. He had mentioned turning it into a community garden someday, a place where children could play safely and families could plant vegetables together. The thought of that dream stirred something deep in her chest. She realized that what gave Harold joy had never been the money itself, it had been the idea of leaving the world just a little kinder than he found it. She whispered his name as she placed her palm flat on the documents. Then, as though feeling Harold's steady hand guiding her, she made a decision that came from the very core of who she had become after a life at his side. She would donate the majority of their savings. She would use his land to help people who had nothing. She would finish the mission he had only been able to dream about. The very next day, she dressed in her best cardigan, pinned her thinning hair neatly, and walked into the town's community office carrying a folder of documents against her chest. The clerk, a woman in her early 40s with gentle eyes, was startled when she explained her intentions. Lorna described her plan in detail. She wanted to use half of the savings to build a shelter for children whose families were struggling, a place with beds, books, warm meals, and mentors who could guide them. The remaining money would create a scholarship fund for local students who had the talent but not the financial means to pursue their education. The land behind the train tracks would be donated to the county to develop into a community center with a garden and a small learning space. The clerk interlaced her fingers beneath her chin, astonished. "Mrs. Ellsworth, this is a remarkable gift. Are you sure? You don't want to keep it for yourself? For your family?" But the moment the clerk mentioned family, something in Lorna's eyes flickered with sorrow. She inhaled slowly, forcing her voice to remain steady. My husband believed kindness should reach beyond bloodlines. My son can manage his own life. This is for people who have no one else. News travels quickly in small communities. Within 2 days, neighbors visited Lana's porch carrying homemade pies, flowers, or simple handwritten notes. Some hugged her tightly, others told her stories of people who would benefit from her generosity. Someone even wrote a small article in the local paper calling her a quiet hero. Lana didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a messenger for Harold's heart. Yet knowing people appreciated his dream warmed her in ways she hadn't felt since the funeral. Later that week, she toured a local children's center to understand what they needed most. The building was old, its paint peeling, but the kids inside filled the space with energy. A girl with messy braids tugged at Lana's sleeve and proudly showed her a drawing she had made of a house with a big sun overhead. "Someday I want to live somewhere safe," the girl said softly. Lana felt her chest tighten. It was then she fully understood the power Harold's savings could have. "You will," she whispered gently. "You will." She visited a modest high school the next day, speaking with administrators about creating scholarships. Many students there worked part-time after school, struggling to afford textbooks or college application fees. Lana felt her purpose settling firmly in place. She imagined Harold standing beside her, nodding with quiet approval. Each evening she returned home exhausted but filled with a new sense of direction. She wrote notes, organized folders, scheduled meetings, and practiced her speech for the town council. For the first time since Harold's death, the house no longer felt suffocating, it felt like a workshop of hope. But in the back of her mind, a faint unease began to grow. She knew her son would eventually return from Miami, and she could already imagine his reaction. Miles had inherited none of Harold's humility or compassion. He valued success, money, and comfort more than connection. Lana worried that he and Heather would try to interfere once they learned of her decision. Their silence during the funeral said enough. Their distance in the days afterward confirmed even more. One evening, after preparing a pot of soup for herself and sitting at the kitchen table with Harold's picture propped across from her, she spoke aloud again. "I'm doing what you would have wanted. I hope you see it. I hope you know I'm trying." The candle beside the photograph flickered, casting soft light across the room. She felt him there, as if the warmth of the flame carried his approval. Yet that fragile peace was destined to be short-lived. Miles and Heather would soon be flying home, their suitcases full of souvenirs and suntan lotion, their minds calculating what they believed they deserved. And though Lana didn't yet know the depths of their intentions, she sensed a storm approaching. It whispered at the edges of her thoughts, reminding her that even the purest acts of kindness can draw out the darkest shadows in others. For now, she held on to hope, unaware that her choice, noble and heartfelt as it was, would soon ignite the conflict that would change her life forever. Miles Ellsworth and his wife Heather returned to Virginia late on a Thursday afternoon, stepping off the plane smelling faintly of coconut sunscreen and overpriced resort cologne. They strolled through the airport hand in hand, laughing about the poolside cocktails they'd drunk and the yacht tour they had taken. From the photos they had posted online, anyone would think they were starring in a travel commercial rather than returning from a trip taken during the week of a parent's funeral. When they finally pulled into Lana's driveway in their spotless SUV, Lana was standing on the porch watering her dying chrysanthemums. She set the watering can down, trying to smooth her sweater and force a smile, hoping perhaps foolishly that her son had returned with even a shadow of remorse. Miles walked up the steps first, sunglasses still on despite the fading daylight. He gave her a brief hug with one arm, the way someone hugs an acquaintance rather than his own mother. Heather stayed a few steps behind, tapping her phone, not even pretending to hide her disinterest. Inside the house, Lana made tea and set out the last of the oatmeal cookies she had baked when preparing for the funeral. Miles sat at the table, drumming his fingers while Heather scrolled through social media. Lana told them gently, cautiously, about her plans to donate the majority of Harold's savings and repurpose the land. She explained the children's shelter, the scholarship program, the community garden, everything she believed Harold would have wanted. She spoke softly but with conviction, her hands trembling around the warm teacup. Miles didn't speak for several seconds. He just stared at her, stunned. Then his jaw tightened. "Are you out of your mind?" His voice was sharp enough to slice the silence in half. Heather looked up from her phone with raised brows, as if she had just witnessed someone confess to a federal crime. "Mom, that money is Dad's legacy," Miles continued. "Our legacy. You can, just give it away." Lana took a breath, her chest tight. "Your father always wanted to help others. He told me that over and over. This is something I believe he would support." Heather leaned forward, her makeup pristine, her expression cold. "Lana, with all due respect, you're 70 next year. You need security. You need someone to take care of things. You shouldn't be making huge financial decisions on your own." "I'm 68, Lana corrected gently. Heather waved the detail away. "Well, old enough." They didn't argue only once. They came back every evening, demanding explanations, insisting Lana reconsider, slowly increasing the pressure. At first the conversations were tense but polite. Within days they turned hostile. Miles slammed doors. Heather raised her voice, calling the idea ridiculous and a waste of good money. They repeatedly asked for access to Harold's accounts, claiming they needed to evaluate the situation properly. Lana refused. Politely at first, then more firmly. But each time she denied them, their anger hardened. On the 6th night, Miles leaned across the table, eyes unrecognizably cold. "If you keep this up, we'll have no choice but to move forward legally," he said. "You're not thinking clearly. Maybe you shouldn't be living alone. Maybe memory problems happen at your age. There's no shame in it." Heather nodded slowly, as if confirming something. "We're only trying to help. If you won't cooperate, we might have to petition the court to make decisions for you. It's safer that way." The meaning struck Lana like an icy wave. They were threatening to have her declared mentally unfit. Her hands shook beneath the tablecloth. She whispered, "Miles, how could you say that? I raised you better." Miles stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "You raised me to be smart enough not to let my inheritance get thrown into the trash." Heather placed a manicured hand on his arm, whispering something Lana couldn't hear. But she saw the way they looked at each other. A signal. A plan. Something silent and dangerous forming between them. After that night, their visits changed. The loud fights stopped, replaced instead by a suspiciously sweet politeness. Heather brought groceries she never used to buy. Miles helped himself to her mail, sorting through envelopes under the guise of helping organize. They insisted on preparing her tea, her breakfast, her evening glass of warm milk. They hovered over her, watching carefully. Too carefully. At first Lana wanted to believe their sudden kindness was real. Perhaps they were trying to make amends. But one morning she woke with a pounding headache so heavy she could barely lift her head. She couldn't remember which day it was. She reached for the phone to call her neighbor but forgot the number. She almost burned a pot on the stove. She sat down halfway through folding laundry and stared at the wall, unable to recall what she had been doing. The next day was worse. Words slipped from her mind. She forgot Harold's middle name. She opened her eyes in the middle of the night, unable to remember where she was. Fear wrapped around her ribs like steel wire. She confided in Miles, hoping he might comfort her. Instead he exchanged a brief, quiet glance with Heather, something dark, victorious. Heather began making her warm milk each evening with a syrupy smile. "Drink, Lana. It'll help you sleep. You need rest." The milk tasted strange bitterness hidden beneath sweetness. Lana noticed the taste only faintly, but her foggy mind couldn't grasp the reason for concern. Her condition worsened. She started misplacing her keys, leaving the front door unlocked, forgetting whether she had eaten. She dropped a glass and didn't remember how it slipped. She saw Heather whispering into her phone late at night, pacing the hall. She saw Miles quietly removing files from Harold's desk. One evening, Lana woke on the sofa with no memory of falling asleep. The TV was flickering static. Her head throbbed so fiercely she cried out. On the coffee table, beside her empty glass of milk, was a small white pill she didn't recognize. She didn't know if she had already taken it. She didn't know where it came from. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers. She typed a few words into her notes app. "Something is wrong. Miles. Heather. Milk. Head hurts. Losing memories. Help." But before she could send it to anyone, her vision blurred again. She sank into the cushions, unable to fight the exhaustion pulling her under like a sinking tide. Outside the house, the world looked calm, porch lights glowing, the wind brushing gently through the trees. But inside, Lana's life was unraveling inch by inch, swallowed by a fog that wasn't natural, a fog deliberately placed there by the two people who should have protected her. And in the silent space between her fading thoughts, she whispered Harold's name, begging him to guide her because deep down she sensed the truth, even if she could no longer fully form the words. Her son and his wife were trying to break her mind. They wanted her weak. They wanted her silent. They wanted her out of the way. For the first time, Lana felt fear sharper than grief. And the storm she had sensed was no longer approaching. It had already arrived, and she was trapped in its center. Riley Hart lived in the small blue house next door, a place that always smelled faintly of vanilla candles and old paperback novels. At 23, she carried a gentleness that came from enduring more than most people her age. Raised in foster homes after losing her parents in a highway accident when she was 8, she grew up understanding loneliness in a way that settled permanently behind her ribs. That was why she had always gravitated toward Lana Ellsworth, because kindness recognizes kindness. From the first day she moved in, Lana had brought her homemade blueberry muffins, offered gardening tips, and invited her over on holidays so she wouldn't eat dinner alone. Over time, an unspoken bond formed between them, something fragile yet deeply comforting, almost like the family Riley had been denied. For months before Harold passed away, Riley had made it a habit to check on Lana. Sometimes she brought over a basket of peaches from the market, other times she helped trim the rose bushes. After the funeral, she visited even more often, knowing grief could swallow a person whole if left untended. But recently, Lana's behavior had changed in ways Riley could not ignore. Their usual conversations had grown shorter. Lana seemed slower, almost foggy. Once, she forgot Riley's name mid-sentence, something so unlike her that Riley felt a knot tighten in her stomach. But she pushed aside the worry, telling herself that grief takes many shapes. One afternoon, however, everything changed. It was a windy Saturday, the kind of day when fallen leaves swirled in tiny spirals across the yard. Riley walked over with a jar of homemade soup, hoping to cheer Lana up. She knocked twice, waited, then knocked again. No reply. She stepped around the house toward the backyard, calling Lana's name gently. That was when she saw her. Lana was standing alone on the grass, her slippers soaked with morning dew, her expression distant and unfocused. Her hair was disheveled, her clothes mismatched, an oversized cardigan paired with pajama pants. She swayed slightly, as though the earth beneath her feet were tilting. When she turned her head toward Riley, Her eyes were completely vacant.
Lana? Are you feeling okay?
Riley rushed toward her, grabbing her arms just in time before she stumbled. Lana opened her mouth, but the words came out broken. "Me Miles milk no," her voice trembled, and her gaze darted between the house and the ground, as if she had been running from shadows only she could see. Alarm shot through Riley. She guided Lana inside, sitting her gently on the couch. The living room was a mess, blankets tossed across the floor, mail scattered on the coffee table, dishes crusted with milk residue, and the faint smell of something sour hanging in the air. The house had never looked like this. Lana had always been meticulous, tidy, organized down to the last drawer. Something was terribly wrong. Riley checked Lana's pulse and temperature. Both were unusual. Her skin felt clammy, her heartbeat slow and heavy. Lana whispered again, "Miles Heather Pills milk," then clutched her temples, crying out in pain. A chill ran through Riley's spine. She searched the kitchen for clues, opening cabinets, trash bins, and the refrigerator. There, beside the milk carton, she found a bottle of prescription pill-strong memory-suppressing medication used for late-stage dementia patients. The label was peeled off, and the dosage instructions were missing. Her hands shook as she turned the bottle over. This wasn't just medication, it was a weapon. Her breath caught. Someone was drugging Lana. Riley felt panic rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had grown up in situations where staying calm meant survival. She knelt beside Lana, brushing back her hair. "I'm taking you to the hospital right now. Hold on to me, okay? You're safe. I've got you." Lana nodded weakly, clutching Riley's sleeve like a lifeline. Riley half carried, half guided her to her car and sped toward the nearest emergency room. She didn't even wait for a wheelchair. Nurses rushed over as soon as they saw Lana slumped against Riley. The doctors whisked Lana away for tests, asking Riley rapid-fire questions she could barely answer. After what felt like hours, a physician approached her with a file in hand. His expression was serious, almost angry. "MS. Heart, Mrs. Ellsworth has toxic levels of memory-impairing medication in her system. This wasn't an accident. Someone has been administering it repeatedly." Riley's throat tightened. She knew who had access to Lana. She knew who had motive. The puzzle pieces came together in a horrifying click. She spent the entire night in the hospital, refusing to leave Lana's side. When Lana finally woke, her eyes clearer than they had been in weeks, the first thing she saw was Riley holding her hand. Tears rolled down her cheeks, and she whispered, "You came, you found me." Riley brushed her thumb over the back of Lana's wrinkled hand. "I told you I'd look out for you. You not alone. Not ever again." During the next few days, as Lana slowly recovered, Riley stayed with her. She braided her hair in the mornings, fed her warm broth, read to her when headaches flared, and spoke softly to keep her grounded. At night, they watched the city lights from the hospital window, and sometimes Lana would fall asleep with her head against Riley's shoulder. When Lana regained her full awareness, she broke down describing the strange milk, the pills, the fog, and the fear. Riley listened without interruption, feeling her stomach twist in fury. How could someone do this to their own mother? How could Miles, this man Lana raised with love, plot against her so cruelly? Riley took a deep breath and finally said, "Lana, they're trying to take everything from you. They want your house, your savings, your land, all of it. And they're willing to break you to get it." Lana closed her eyes, pain rushing through her features. "I loved them, I trusted them." "I know," Riley whispered, squeezing her hand. "But now you trust me. And I swear to you, we're going to fight back." The words were simple, but they carried weight, heavy, unshakable, burning with resolve. When Lana was discharged, Riley insisted she stay at her house for the first night. She made soup, helped her shower, tucked her into the guest bed, and stayed awake in a chair nearby, guarding the door like a sentinel. She had no intention of letting anyone get close enough to hurt Lana again. The next morning, they returned to Lana's home. The air inside felt thick with hidden danger, but Lana was no longer the weakened woman collapsing in her backyard. She stood a little straighter, breathing evenly, her gaze firm. Riley stayed close beside her, scanning the rooms with narrowed eyes. "I'm not running from my own home," Lana said quietly. "Not anymore." Riley nodded. "Then we take the next step. We find proof. And we make them answer for what they've done." In that moment, something solidified between them, something more powerful than fear, more enduring than blood. Lana had lost a son, but she had gained a warrior who refused to let injustice stand. And now, together, they would begin the fight that would expose everything hidden in the shadows. The days that followed were unlike anything Lana Ellsworth had ever lived through. For the first time in weeks, her mind felt clear, not entirely healed, but no longer drowning in that unnatural fog. Yet clarity brought terror. Because now she remembered every strange taste in her milk, every pounding headache, every time Miles and Heather watched her with calculating eyes. The realization that her own son had tried to dismantle her mind left a wound far deeper than grief. But she was not alone. Riley stood at her side like an anchor in a storm. On the morning after Lana's return from the hospital, Riley sat with her at the dining table, a notebook spread open, a pen in hand. "We need proof," she said, her voice steady.
Real, undeniable, inescapable proof.
"Not just what we know, what we can show." Lana nodded slowly. "They'll deny everything. They'll lie. They always lie." Riley placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "Then we'll make sure they can't lie their way out of this." Riley spent hours researching surveillance devices, tiny cameras the size of shirt buttons, motion-triggered audio recorders, discrete USB chargers with built-in microphones, and a slim device that could be tucked behind picture frames. She ordered everything from a same-day delivery service, her hands trembling not with fear, but with determination. By evening, the dining table was covered in a spread of gadgets. For a moment, Lana stared at them with apprehension. These weren't things she had ever imagined needing in her quiet little life. But Riley's confidence steadied her. Together, they moved through the house, hiding devices with meticulous care. They tucked a camera inside the ceramic vase on the mantel. Another was slipped between books on Harold's old shelf. Riley placed audio recorders behind the curtains, under the kitchen counter, inside the lamp base, anywhere unnoticed but effective.
"This feels like something out of a movie," Lana whispered. Riley gave a small smile.
"Well, your son turned your life into one. We're just rewriting the ending." That night, Lana slept lightly, instinctively aware that danger still circled. Riley stayed awake in the living room with the lights dimmed, a baseball bat beside her chair, an odd sight for someone so gentle, but she would have swung it without hesitation. Miles and Heather returned the next afternoon without warning. Lana was in the kitchen when she heard the front door open and their voices spill. Insharp, rushed, tense. Riley gave her the smallest nod. Everything was recording. Miles stomped through the house as if he owned it, muttering curses about lawyers and paperwork. Heather ransacked drawers, slamming them open and shut. They believed Lana was still mentally compromised. They believed they could act freely. At one point, Miles said loudly, "She must be losing it faster than we expected. Another week on the pills and she won't even know who she is."
Heather laughed.
"Perfect. Once she signs the property transfer, we'll get her set up in a facility."
She won. Remember a thing. Riley, hidden behind the hallway wall, felt rage pulse hot beneath her skin.
Her recorded audio caught every word. But the worst came minutes later, in the office where Harold's documents had been stored. Miles found the folder he had been searching for and whispered to his wife, "If she wakes up too much, we push harder. That pharmacy sold me stronger stuff, just have to mix it into her drinks again. Maybe even double dose." Heather hummed casually, as though discussing weekend plans. "Or we make it look like she tripped down the stairs.
Old people fall all the time."
At those words, Lorna, standing frozen in the kitchen doorway, felt her knees weaken. She gripped the counter to keep herself from collapsing. That was her son.
Her only child.
And he was plotting her death with the woman he called his partner. Riley stepped silently to Lorna's side and steadied her, guiding her away before the couple returned to the kitchen. Hours later, after Miles and Heather left, Riley gathered all the recordings into her laptop. She played each file, her jaw tightening with every vile word captured.
"This is enough," Riley whispered.
"More than enough. We're going to the police first thing in the morning." But the universe had its own timing. The very next night, while the house was quiet and the neighborhood streetlights buzzed faintly in the distance, Lorna and Riley sat together reviewing the final audio files once more. That was when Riley noticed something strange, a shadow passing across the living room window. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Before Lorna could answer, the faintest sound echoed outside.
Gravel crunching beneath slow, deliberate footsteps.
Riley's heart began to pound. She moved toward the window, peeking through the curtain's edge. Miles and Heather were there. But they weren't knocking. They weren't approaching the door. They were standing near Riley's house.
Heather carried a gas can.
Riley felt her breath stop in her throat.
"Oh my God, Lana, call 911.
Now." But it was too late. Flames erupted almost instantly, the gasoline igniting in a bright, hungry blaze that raced along the siding of Riley's home. Within moments, the fire roared upward, black smoke curling into the night sky.
Riley dashed outside, screaming, "No! No! My house, me house!"
Lorna cried for her to come back, but Riley couldn't tear her eyes away from the inferno that swallowed her living room window. The heat struck her face like an open furnace. Neighbors began to shout, alarms rang, smoke choked the air. The fire leapt across the wall faster than anyone could react. Riley felt the blast of heat against her skin, then a burning pain as sparks landed on her arm. The flames climbed higher, swallowing her roof, her furniture, the bookshelf her foster mother once gifted her, the only photographs she had left from childhood, everything. Sirens wailed in the distance. Before she could step back more safely, something in the house exploded. A lamp? A gas line? She didn't know. The force sent her backward, slamming her onto the lawn. Pain erupted down her leg and across her arm in a hot, searing pulse. Lorna clutched her, sobbing, trying to pull her away from the flames as fire trucks screeched to a stop. In the chaos, officers grabbed Miles and Heather, cuffing them as they screamed excuses and lies that dissolved into the smoke.
"You can prove anything,"
Heather shrieked, even as gasoline soaked her shoes and the remnants of the gas can lay half-melted beside her. But they could prove everything.
Every recording.
Every threat.
Every confession.
Riley, shaking and burned, watched as the officers forced the couple into the back of a police car. Despite her pain, she lifted her chin high with a fierce, wounded pride. Later, in the hospital bed, bandages wrapped around her arm and side, she whispered to Lorna, "It's over. We got them.
They can hurt you anymore." Lorna leaned over her, tears sliding freely down her face. "You lost everything because of me."
Riley smiled weakly. "I didn't lose everything.
I still have you."
And for the first time in her life, those words didn't feel like a consolation, they felt like truth. What Miles and Heather had tried to destroy only forged something stronger, a bond built not by blood, but by loyalty, sacrifice, and a shared understanding of what real family meant. And this time, justice was finally within reach. The courthouse in Fairfax County was colder than Lorna expected. The high ceilings, polished marble floors, and echoing footsteps made her feel small, as though she had stepped into a world designed to intimidate. Yet she walked forward with quiet resolve, her hand resting lightly on Riley's arm for support. Riley moved slower than usual, her burns still healing, her legs stiff from the explosion, but her presence radiated strength. Between them, they carried more than evidence. They carried truth. Inside the courtroom, the buzz of low voices faded the moment the bailiff announced the case. Miles Ellsworth and Heather Ellsworth were escorted in by deputies, wrists chained, orange jumpsuits stark and unforgiving under the fluorescent lights. Miles looked thinner, paler, but the bitterness in his gaze burned like acid. Heather kept her chin raised, wearing the expression of someone who still believed she could lie her way back to freedom. Lorna's breath trembled when she saw them. Her son. Her only son. The boy she had rocked to sleep, the teenager she cheered for on school stages, the man she once prayed would grow into someone kind. Now he stared at her as if she were the enemy. She gripped Riley's hand, grounding herself, reminding herself that some people choose darkness even when raised in the light. The trial began with the prosecution outlining the charges: attempted poisoning, attempted murder through aggravated arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and intentional destruction of property. Each count echoed through the courtroom with the weight of undeniable moral decay. The defense attorney tried to paint Lorna as unstable, insisting she had memory issues and exaggerated the situation, but the argument fell apart within minutes. First came the medical testimony. The doctor who treated Lorna explained the concentration of memory-suppressing medication in her bloodstream, the levels so unnaturally high they could only have been administered intentionally and repeatedly. The courtroom gasped when he stated that continued dosage could have resulted in permanent neurological damage or even fatal heart complications. Lorna lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Next, the prosecution presented the recordings, every whisper, every threat, every plan Miles and Heather had spoken inside that house. The jury listened in horrified silence as Miles' voice played through the speakers. "She'll sign eventually. And if not, we'll make it look like she fell." Heather's voice followed, sharp and cold, "Just double the dose. She won't know the difference." One juror covered her mouth with her hand. Another shook his head in disbelief. Even the judge's expression hardened. Then came the evidence of the fire. Fire investigators testified about gasoline traces, burn patterns, and the remnants of the melted gas can. The officers who responded to the scene described finding the couple smelling strongly of fuel. A neighbor testified he saw them sneaking through the yard that night, though he hadn't understood what was happening until he saw the flames. And finally, Riley took the stand. She walked slowly, steadying herself on the railing. Her arm bore visible scars beneath her sleeve, and her voice wavered only once when she described seeing her home erupt in flames, everything she owned consumed in seconds. But when she turned to Miles and Heather, her gaze sharpened like steel. "You didn't just try to steal from Lorna," she said. "You tried to erase her. You tried to erase me. But we're still here. And you're here because of your own choices." Heather looked away. Miles clenched his jaw, refusing to meet Riley's eyes. When the closing arguments ended, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a reputation for uncompromising fairness, delivered the sentence with a voice that rang through every corner of the courtroom. For the attempted poisoning of a vulnerable adult, for the malicious arson that endangered multiple lives, and for the conspiracy to obtain property through fraud, I hereby sentence Miles Ellsworth and Heather Ellsworth to 15 years in the Virginia Department of Corrections. Miles finally broke, slamming his fist on the defense table, shouting accusations, blaming Lana, blaming Riley, blaming everyone except himself. Heather sobbed hysterically, insisting she never meant for anything to go that far, but her tears spilled too late to matter. As deputies escorted them out, Lana didn't look away. She watched her son disappear behind the heavy door, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and relief. It was the hardest moment of her life, but she knew deep inside that justice did not always come wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it came wrapped in loss. When Riley returned to her seat beside her, Lana reached for her hand. "It's over," Lana whispered. "Truly over." Riley squeezed back. "Now we get to rebuild." And rebuild they did. In the months that followed, Riley moved into Lana's home permanently. Contractors arrived daily to help restore the charm of the old house, repairing the worn floors, repainting faded walls, installing new windows and a safer front lock. Riley rebuilt her life from the ashes literally, and Lana insisted on paying for the replacement of her belongings with funds she had originally set aside for home maintenance. Riley protested at first, but Lana only smiled and said, "Family helps family." They planted flowers together in the spring: sunflowers for Harold, marigolds for protection, lavender for peace. The backyard, once a place of quiet sorrow, became a sanctuary of warm colors and buzzing bees. Children from the neighborhood wandered in to admire the garden, and Lana welcomed them with lemonade and stories about Harold's dream of helping others. Meanwhile, construction began on the children's shelter funded in Harold's name, the Harold Ellsworth Haven. Lana attended every planning meeting, accompanied by Riley, who became her unofficial advocate and assistant. The small plot of land Harold once owned was transformed into a community center with a garden, a reading room, and a space for weekend tutoring programs. Local volunteers joined, offering to paint walls, donate books, or hold workshops. The scholarship fund launched too, supporting students who needed financial help to pursue college. On the day the shelter opened, the mayor cut the ribbon while Lana and Riley stood arm in arm. Dozens of children poured into the building, laughing, exploring, racing across the hallways. Lana's eyes sparkled with joy and pride as she whispered to Riley, "He would have loved this." Riley smiled. "He'd be proud of you." As the sunset painted the sky gold and pink, Lana looked over at Riley. A young woman who had once been alone in the world. A woman who risked her life to save hers. A woman who, through pain and fire and courage, had become her daughter in every way that mattered. "You're my family now," Lana said softly. Riley rested her head on Lana's shoulder. "And you're mine." There was no need for blood to define bond. No need for birth certificates to define love. Sometimes, family is found in the most unexpected places, born not of obligation, but of compassion, sacrifice, and the fierce belief that every life has value. In the end, the darkness Miles and Heather tried to force upon their lives had only strengthened the light that remained. And together, Lana and Riley walked forward into a future built not from fear, but from kindness and the unbreakable truth that justice, once given a voice, can change everything.